belief that we owe it to our ancestors as well. As the first historically Black institution of higher learning in the state of Maryland, founded in 1865, at a time of strife in this country, as slavery was ending, we know that we owe it to our ancestors to take up that mantle and to do more and make sure that we live out the legacies that have been handed down to us. This evening is about ensuring that the good within each one of us and within our communities wins out. Tonight is not about looking back, and it's not about looking to someone else to make it better, but to look within each and every one of us and find the courage to speak out and speak up and say enough. And let's remind one another across this country that it is our obligation to respect each human being, care about one another, and to enrich our communities by making them a safe place for this and future generations. I have hope that this event will spark more people to come together and agree that we as a people have shared values for peace,
decency, and civility. The Bowie State University campus community truly appreciates the love and outpouring that was received when Richie was lost to us. We thank those here today and those who continue to support the legacy of Lieutenant Collins that was left to us. I want to take this opportunity to thank Dawn and Richard Collins for creating a scholarship fund to benefit future generations of students who aspire, as Richie did, to achieve a college degree. The Collins family knows that they will always be a part of this Bowie State University family. You are our family. And you know that you have a special place in our hearts and forever will. Their commitment to creating pathways of opportunity for future students through the 2nd Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III Social Justice Scholarship Fund is a true testament that even in the wake of tragedy, hope can and will prevail. We are also grateful to our legislators who have honored the legacy of Lieutenant Collins through their efforts to provide scholarships for the students who want to enroll in ROTC programs at our historically Black colleges and universities will have the wherewithal to do so. I want to especially recognize the leadership on that effort with Maryland Senate President Mike Miller of District 27 and Maryland Senate Majority Leader Doug J.J. Peters, who co-sponsored legislation in 2018 that established the annual $1 million 2nd Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III Leadership with Honor Scholarship to support ROTC cadets attending each of our 4 HBCUs in the state of Maryland. That, just so that you know, that is $250,000 for each one of our institutions. If you ever see Senate President Mike Miller or Doug J.J. Peters, please take a moment out to say thank you to them for their leadership on that endeavor. And so on behalf of the BSU administration, faculty, staff, and the 6,300 plus students here at BSU, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to everyone gathered here tonight who have made the time to participate in this event this evening. You represent a small minority, but I believe a growing group of people who want to see change take place in our country and in the world. One conversation at a time. It was Nelson Mandela who once said, "No one is born hating one person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can learn and be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." Let us continue to teach one another how to love, honor, and respect our differences while carrying the legacy and memory of Second Lieutenant Collins in your hearts. To the Collins family, thank you for continuing to share Richie with us in mind, in heart, in memory, and in spirit. In a shared commitment to upholding the legacy for Richie and working together to create a safer and more inclusive campus community, please now join me in welcoming my colleague from the University of Maryland, College Park. Please all welcome Dr. Linda M. Clement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bro. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for having me. We join the family and friends of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins and the Bowie State University community in honoring a wonderful young man this evening. From all we have learned at College Park, Lieutenant Collins was a rising star, poised to graduate and become a leader in the community and a proud member of the armed forces. We are all devastated by the senseless loss of this bright, vibrant life. Across our country and across our world, as Dr. Bro said, we continue to see the acts of terror and hatred directed against law-abiding people, be they students, veterans, congregants, and others, even as recently as just a few days ago. We must work together to enable a conversation that shifts the paradigm from animosity to understanding and appreciation of our differences. In order to continue that conversation, students on our campus have organized a town hall meeting to remember Lieutenant Collins and to address hate and to fight for change. We welcome you to attend the town hall meeting on May 20th at 5 p.m. and join in the discussion. Details are available on the web. Dr. Lowe sincerely regrets not being able to be here this evening, and I'm honored to represent our campus. Our thoughts and condolences are with the Collins family, and thank you for including us in this important evening.
Thank you, Dr. Clements. Thank you, Dr. Bro. Oh, someone took my speaker notes. Pardon me, someone took my speaker notes. Thank you. I want to make sure I stay on task. All right. So one of the things I wanted to also do is to recognize all of our guests who are here from outside of Bowie State University. Raise your hand if this is the first time that you have visited our campus. Raise them high. All right. Bowieyites, let's give everyone a welcoming round of applause for coming to visit this campus. Please don't let this be your last time visiting Bowie State University. We have a lot to offer, and the next time that you come here, remember your family now. Where we are on the agenda is an opportunity for us to present an artistic tribute to Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III. And one of the reasons why we on the planning committee wanted to make sure that we included artistic tributes is because although this is a serious occasion, we didn't want it to be a somber occasion. This is a celebration and a look forward. And on that note, it is my pleasure to introduce the Bowie State University Magical Singers.
where he was called Tuimbe. The Swahili is Tuimbe, Tuchetse Sate. Let us sing, let us all dance together.
Thank you to our wonderful students. That truly was an uplifting rendition. At this point, I would like to introduce Dawn and Richard Collins II, but before they get up here, as they make their way up, I want to tell you how much this couple means to this community and to this institution. Their strength strengthens us, and we so appreciate being in relationship with such a wonderful family. Ladies and gentlemen, Dawn and Richard Collins.
Good evening to everyone. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your busy days to come and share this moment with us for this very important work that we're about to embark on. We're on a journey, Dawn and I, since this has happened, and I have to say, so many people come up to us and say, you know, how strong we are, but let me just tell you, there is no strength in us. We're actually a mess, you know, even though you may not see that now. But I can tell you this, it's moments such as this one that gives us strength, you know, and gives us the courage to be able to get up out of bed one more day and face the world that day. So know that the things that you're doing today is no small thing as far as we're concerned. It is an important thing for us in taking the time out first to help us to celebrate the life of our son, but more importantly, to face the challenges that we have in our society today, which is part of, you know, each of our responsibilities is to face these challenges head on. The hate that we see in the world today is nothing but a challenge, and we have to resolve in ourselves that that is our purpose, that we're going to confront this and we will be victorious in the end. I want to thank each and every one of you once again for being here, and continue to pray for us as we continue to pray for each and every one of you. Thank you.
I had something written out, but I don't think I'm going to do ad-lib. I'm going to do what I need to do. It's coming from the heart. First of all, I want to thank the Bowie State family and the gracious lady of this house, Dr. Bro. From the very beginning, when this happened, Dr. Bro loved on the Collins family as if we were one of our own. She not only spoke it, but she showed it. There's so many in the Bowie State family that I can't take the time to just say thank you from my heart, from a mother's heart. Then there's another wonderful woman that I have to acknowledge in this audience, and that's Dr. Nunez. I'm going to be brief in saying this. Dr. Nunez had her students do an assignment, and they wrote cards of condolences to our family, and I still have those, and I will always cherish those. But I reached out to Dr. Nunez, and she and I had coffee. And she said to me, Mrs. Collins, what is it that I can do? Tell me, and I'm going to execute. One of the things I said, Dr. Bro, Richard said that the world should know his name. And she said, okay, how are we going to do that? I gave her one of the bracelets with his name on it. She took that bracelet around the world with her on her trips. And she said, I spoke about who your son was and is, so the world does know his name. Then when she came back, she says, okay, what else? So I said, Dr. Nunez, I want to make a change. I want the world to not forget the essence of who Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III is, the essence of who Rick and I are. And she says, okay. So she partnered with Bowie State and made this happen. So I say all that to say, have an idea, but don't be afraid to execute. That is my challenge to everyone in here. You know, hate is darkness, and darkness cannot prevail where there's light. So therefore, we have to be that light and that beam. And see, Richard was light. If you knew anything about him, he was light all the way. So I say this in parting. Be that light. Be that beacon. Do not let anyone put your light under a basket. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. and Mrs. Collins. At this time, we'd like to show you a short video presentation made possible to us by the Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III Foundation.
For that Uber on Saturday night.
Our son was there on the University of Maryland campus, and he was with two of his acquaintances, friends, and this strange young white male just approached them and made a statement to step to the left if you know what's good for you. And our son said no, and he stabbed him in the chest.
He had a mother and father that loved each other and loved our children. We loved our children. We wanted our children. We thought we lived in neighborhoods that were safe. We talked to them all the time about where to go, who to be with. It's ironic. We would tell Richard to be careful about being safe in certain areas, but never did we ever say, be careful about going to the University of Maryland.
Richard Collins was preparing to receive his own diploma this week from nearby Bowie State University and serve his country. He completed his ROTC training and was commissioned last Thursday as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army.
Hannibal of Carthage is quoted as saying, "Aut viam inviam, aut faciem," find a way or make one. I feel as this quote described my college experience completely. I faced adversity throughout my time in the university, but I always seemed to find a way to overcome that adversity. 4 years ago, I came to Bowie State University. At that time, no other day besides this one has brought me such joy and happiness as today, the day that I get to be with all my friends, family, cadre, and the day of my commission. I thank all of the faculty and staff here at Bowie State University for developing me into the man that I am, and most importantly, I thank the Lord my God for showing me providence in my life so far, and I hope He continues to do so. As I begin my military career, I'll keep each one of you that helped shape me in my heart and close to my mind. I'll never be a stranger. Thank you.
We were so proud of him that day of commissioning. We were elated. One of the last conversations he said to me, he said, "Mom, I made it, and the world is going to know my name." We want the young men and women that will be recipients of this scholarship to first and foremost know who Richard is, know the essence of him, know that we believe in hard work, but we also believe in giving people equal chances. And we believe wholeheartedly, given the chance, anyone and everyone will succeed.
I see my son and so many other young people, and I just feel that it's God's calling to give back.
That's why it's important that it's not just tied to ROTC, that it is to deserving students. Rick and I know that just having that extra push of having education cause. So with us doing something like this in Richard's name, it's going to help somebody.
All right, if we could raise the house lights. All right, now we've engaged your hearts. Now we want to engage your mind. We have pulled together.
Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church.
All right, we're going to engage your spirit as well. Somebody say, I heard a word. So at this point, I am so happy to have this opportunity to tell you all a little bit about the panelists who have agreed to come from far and wide today to discuss this entire concept, not just how this individual incident impacted our community, our two campuses, this wonderful family, but also about what this means for us as a society as a whole moving forward. On the panel, I want to, and if you could make your way up as I introduce you, we have one of Bowie State's own students, a young man who will be graduating May 17th. The clock is ticking. Mr. Dawuda Amadou. Mr. Amadou is a student leader, and for those of you all who are on our campus, you know you see him everywhere, and he is an outstanding example of the product that Bowie State University is producing. Next, coming all the way from Montgomery, Alabama, representing the Southern Poverty Law Center, we have Taffany English. This next gentleman, who is a faculty member at the University of Maryland, College Park, has also recently been named a Brookings Institute Fellow. And he's also the type of gentleman that, if you catch him at the right time, on the right conversation, will engage you deeply about all of these issues and how they intersect. Dr. Rayshawn Ray. And moderating our panel this afternoon is renowned author and investigative reporter, Dax Devlin Ross. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Ross.
Great. You can have a seat. So thank you all for being here today. We really, really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you and to engage your minds in this conversation. I'm really excited to just be a moderator, to have some questions to ask to this really thoughtful crew to my right. So I'm going to speak as little as possible and allow them to hold the space for us. I do want to acknowledge, though, that I would not be here myself personally if it were not for my relationship with a fabulous foundation called the Fund 2 Foundation, which connected me initially with the Collins family and connected me specifically with Mrs. Collins here, who I have since had weekly conversations with, just thinking about how do we move forward. And I'm really just consistently impressed with your spirit, and I appreciate you inviting me in to play a small role in this work that you're doing, you and your husband. And I just have so much respect and admiration for both of you, so thank you again. So we're going to move into this conversation. And I'm going to actually jump in and start with you initially to my right, Professor. And I have a question for you, and I've written my questions out, and you've also seen the questions. But in my conversations with Ms. Collins, she's spoken with gratitude and appreciation for your efforts as a professor, as a scholar, and a community advocate to lift up Richard's life and educate students and your college community. I would love for you to just talk a little bit about what you've done, what has inspired you to take this action and these efforts on behalf of Richard's life, and why you think this in particular is such an important case to keep alive in the public eye.
Yeah, I mean, these are a great set of questions. I mean, well, first off, I mean, I'm just honored to be here. I mean, I tend to think that events like this carry on people's legacies, and it's very, very important to do, because I think in our society, particularly the way that technology and the media operates, things are on a 24-hour cycle. And at times we have the ability to forget things that are really, really important. And Lieutenant Collins is someone who is really, really important. And when I think about it personally, I think about first that Lieutenant Collins could have been anyone's son. I mean, when we look at Prince George's County, I mean, he could have been anyone's son in Prince George's County. And in that regard, he could have been anyone's son around the country. And as a father who has two sons who vividly know who Lieutenant Collins is, that's something that I also think about, being a father. I also think about it from the perspective of being a professor at the University of Maryland where this incident happened. And I can't walk around and act like it didn't happen. I can't walk around and act like that it's not impacting me, that it's not impacting my students, that it's not impacting my community, that it's not impacting the church I go to, that it's not impacting my neighborhood, that it's not impacting the school that my kids go to. It impacts everything. And if we act like it doesn't, I think we're doing an injustice to not just Lieutenant Collins' legacy, but also the legacy of everyone else who becomes victims oftentimes of hate crimes. I mean, I tend to kind of think about the various things that we've tried to do, and I should also note that Denise Cooper is originally how I ended up coming in contact with Mr. and Mrs. Collins, who I think I have to definitely note this. One thing about noting that Lieutenant Collins could be anyone's son and could be anyone, I think that this is in particular specific to oftentimes the black middle class experience. And the fact that society tells us, particularly African Americans, that you're supposed to go to school, that you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do, that parents are supposed to embrace politics of respectability and raise their children to be upstanding individuals. And when you do that, supposedly we're not supposed to deal with racism and hate. Supposedly our socioeconomic status and our politics of respectability allegedly remove us from dealing with these particular issues. And I think one of the big things that Lieutenant Collins' murder highlights is that Mr. and Mrs. Collins did everything right, everything that they were supposed to do, everything that society said. And still, that wasn't enough to prevent their son from being a victim of a hate crime. And so, I mean, what we've tried to do, I think the first thing to note, and Mrs. Collins noted this for Professor Zita Nunez, who's one of my colleagues at the University of Maryland, one of the things she did was after this incident, she took it upon herself to sit out in front of McKeldin Library at the University of Maryland and literally ask students to write letters to the family. And she collected hundreds of these letters. One of the things that an organization, a group that I work with at the University of Maryland, the Critical Race Initiative, did was they took these letters and put them in a scrapbook that we presented to Mr. and Mrs. Collins a few weeks ago at the Parent Mitchell Symposium. Some of the other things that we've tried to do is we've simply just tried to really hit the ground running. And part of this is, for me, is aiming to raise awareness about hate crimes and domestic terrorism. For some reason, we have a problem with saying domestic and terrorism right behind each other. We have no problem with saying terrorism about things that happen internationally. But for some reason, we have a problem with saying it when we're talking about what's happening here. And one thing we know that I'm sure you'll speak to, that we know from the Southern Poverty Law Center, is the huge increases we've seen in hate crimes around the country, and the huge increase we've seen in hate groups. So some of the things we've aimed to do to combat this, because I think part of thinking about this is we could talk about the problems, but one of the things that Mr. and Mrs. Collins and the foundation aims to do is to push us toward what are solutions. So first, one of the things we did was we met with Delegate Jazz Lewis, who represents Prince George's County and Annapolis, and we started thinking through ways that we can actually enhance hate crime legislation, which I think is particularly important, and I think we'll talk more about that. Second, we had Mr. Collins and Mrs. Collins speak at the Reed Temple AME Church men's conference that happened a couple of months ago and raise some money for the scholarship that's specifically here at Bowie State. Third, we contacted media outlets to let them know about these activities. I think part of what's important in keeping the public consciousness about this incident is to make sure that the media is aware of incidents like this, and particularly aware of events that are aiming to kind of chronicle and talk about the sort of things that we can do. And then lastly, what we aim to do is, I'm one of the editors of Context Magazine, Sociology for the Public, and our summer issue, where I actually feature Mr. and Mrs. Collins, an interview with them, and also a picture of them on the cover of the magazine so that we can spread across to academic communities, policy communities, and nonprofit communities.
So impressive. So I want to continue on, I think, one of the first points that you made, which is a personal connection to yourself and how you could see yourself in that experience. And to my far right, we have a young man who is on the cusp of graduation. We have a young man who is, based on his bio, I hope all of you had a chance to look at this bio, has just done impressive things at this university over the last 4 years, and who was also himself a second lieutenant. And I've just learned as soon as you graduate, be heading off to Fort Knox, correct, in Tennessee.
Kentucky.
So with all of, sorry, in Kentucky. So for all of us in this room, I think I just wanted to ask you this question, just keeping in mind as a student, as someone who is so you actually had a relationship with Lieutenant Collins as well. How did you first come in contact with Richard? And as a second and follow-up question, knowing all that you know about his life and in his untimely death, how does that impact you and the choices you find yourself making now?
Okay, thank you for that question. Initially, I came in contact with Lieutenant Collins through the ROTC program here. He was always very lively, brought smiles to everybody's faces all the time. His story, it impacted the decisions that I make now. It kind of makes me double think before I make a decision. For example, prior to this, I had no problem going down to University of Maryland College Park. After this, there's been a type of fear that I've had with going down to College Park. Like Mrs. Collins mentioned earlier, College Park is not one of those places where you have to think twice to go down to, or you think it's not a safe area when you're going down to it. And the night of the murder, I received a text from Lieutenant Collins himself inviting me out to be at College Park with him. It was a text sent out to myself and several other cadets in the program. And unfortunately, we were all away at training at the time. And we couldn't go down to College Park with him at that time. That changed my view of the standard of what we accept as what's acceptable for somebody to do. What I mean by this is when someone is showing actions or any types of behavior, we ourselves, we have to evaluate what's acceptable, how much of it is acceptable. When someone's affiliated with any type of hate or any type of groups, that sponsor hate, we have to evaluate that and we have to report these things. And thirdly, this changed my perception on when we vote. When you're voting and putting leaders in place, you have to in place leaders that are going to enact change. We can't in place leaders who speak about change but don't enact change. This occurrence, it changed my view on who I vote for. Prior to this, I voted if on the surface I believe they aligned with what I believed in. But now I do research, I look at their backgrounds, I look at the issues that I care about, such as this. I look at what has been their past responses to these issues. What have they done in the past to issues similar to this? And that influences my vote as well. And a big acknowledgement as well to our senators and congressmen who not only did not just speak, but they also took action as well for this occurrence.
Wow. Thank you. Wow. So that I'm going to come back to the middle now. It's Taffany. Taffany. I want to say Taffany. Many of us, and already Professor Ray's already invoked SPLC, but many of us know about the Southern Poverty Law Center's past legal work to ostensibly dismantle the Ku Klux Klan. But less well known to some of us in this room is the work that the organization does today. So could you talk a little bit about what the Southern Poverty Law Center does to combat hate and extremism, and how that work continues to advance the spirit of the founding mission and vision of the organization?
Okay, sure. And first, let me say I am just so honored to be here and so honored to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Collins. I actually remember exactly where I was when we heard of the news of Lieutenant Collins III. It was me and a colleague of mine, and we both just said, another senseless hate crime. And I think it's very important, as I talk about Southern Poverty Law Center and the historical work that we do, language is really important. And I've heard violent acts. I've heard a senseless act. It was a hate crime, and we have to call it what it is, and we have to be, unapologetic about that, right? Regardless of what the statute says, regardless of what local legislation says. So historically, Southern Poverty Law Center they have their founding in bankrupting white supremacist organizations. And in the early 80s, a 19-year-old black male was hung in Mobile, Alabama by members of the United Klans of America. That was the first case that Mr. Dees and Mr. Levin decided to take on to hold an organization responsible for the actions of their members. United Klans of America has had its strongholds in the crux of the civil rights movement, right? They were responsible for the bombing that killed 4 little girls in Birmingham, responsible for the bombing of the Freedom Riders, of the buses. And so this was a landmark case for Southern Poverty Law Center and set a precedence for them and their work in bankrupting hate organizations. And so we look a few decades ago, so it spanned from the Ku Klux Klan, and then they began to monitor and discover other groups, your neo-Nazi groups, your skinhead groups. And after a couple of Klan groups, there was a case against Tom Metzger, who was a prominent leader of skinheads, right? And so over the years, as the work evolved, they no longer monitored like Klan organizations. They started looking at other types of white supremacist organizations. And over the last few years, outside of the casework, we've seen the Intelligence Project not only produce publication, but also our website is robust. They also track and monitor bias incidents. That is more contextual data for us, where individuals can report to us, and then we may or may not follow it to write stories. And when we write stories and get media attention, it also localizes it, right? So you get local support behind that. And then you have the mobilization of our online portal. You spoke a little bit about the internet and the power of the internet. And that is where we're seeing a lot of these white supremacist organizations are utilizing the internet to radicalize so many people. We look at Dylan Roof, who was radicalized on the internet, who murdered the 9 African-American parishioners, right? And so with that, you have PayPal and you have Amazon, who allow these white supremacist organizations to conduct business, right? So Southern Poverty Law Center has been on the forefront and been instrumental in pushing these organizations to close down services that will allow these white supremacist organizations to move money. So that's some of the work. And then litigation-wise, we don't see kind of us going after white supremacist organizations like maybe we saw 10 years ago. And that is because the world of hate is evolving in so many various facets. We see specifically, we're on a college campus, and I want to hit this now and I'll talk about it more later, but the rise in recruitment on college campuses of white supremacist organizations. And I'm not just talking about student groups, I'm talking about professors who are espousing these beliefs of the alt-right and white nationalists. And, to your point about your fear, right? We have to be honest that that is a thing, right? That is a real fear. It's not something that it's not a hoax. It's not something that people are like are making something big that it's not, right? Because a person being attacked just because of the color of their skin, right? Because of an immutable characteristic that cannot be changed, right? That is a real fear, and that is something that education won't protect you from, right? It happens to the poor, to the middle class, to the rich, and it is because that hatred has a strong hold. It is the fabric of who we are as America, and I think until we really face that and face it in a way that evolves past, gets to your point of resolution, right? So what do we do when we leave this room, right? So I'll stop because I will keep
You
going.
don't have to stop.
Yeah, okay.
You can keep going. But I'm actually going to stay with you for a second because as a journalist, and I wouldn't be doing my work as in my due diligence as a journalist if I didn't ask this question. But the organization SPLC has faced some criticism of late from some of its adversaries who ask, both who appointed the Southern Poverty Law Center, the arbiter of hate and extremism in this country, and they also question whether it in fact judges hate fairly.
Right.
So the question I have is, how do you respond to that criticism?
So I'll say, the idea of like who made us experts, right? And that was the continued fight that we kept pushing back against when people said maybe you shouldn't do this, or people have the right to hate, so how do you intervene with that, right? But it was more about raising and increasing people's awareness that organizations were actually still organizing, that this wasn't something from the 1920s, and it wasn't, just where you had Klan in the 1960s or whatever. These groups are actively organizing. And I think to your point about, them attempting to undermine our work, our investigations, and the influence that we've had and with law enforcement, right, with education and those things, is to undermine our credibility to bring more supporters their way, right? And that is a politically correct answer, right? But with it being politically correct, I think the fact that Southern Poverty Law Center never wavered from their mission. Their mission was to combat hate and extremism in all of its forms. And so we have to make sure that when we are doing that, that when we know that a group is operating by their own definition, right? So when we have a definition, I encourage you all to go to our website. I won't bore you with it, but there's a lot of information if you go to splcenter.org and go to the Intelligence Project to learn more about our work and how we track and monitor hate groups. So it is a myth that we do not just list people because they have a website, right? We list people because of their activities and because of their values and missions that they themselves say that they embrace and that they espouse.
So context is critical. We're in an education environment, so thinking about context is always critical. And many of the people that I've spoken to, and of course a lot of the stuff that I read, there's this underlying belief that there's a culture stemming from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue that has given license to or encouraged a new wave of what can be called race-based hatred in this country. So my question to you, Professor, is do you think this characterization is accurate? And if so, what are you seeing and how does it square with your research, your scholarship regarding the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial inequality?
Yes. So what's coming out of what's coming out of the White House with this current administration is definitely inciting hate and violence around the country. A recent stat we know is that in places where Trump held a campaign rally, that hate crimes have increased over 200% in those areas. Like, that is a simple fact. And so part of when we think about what's happening, obviously, as we just heard from Tiffany, this is happening on and off college campuses. And part of thinking about the fact that people are being radicalized to kind of think about hate in a particular way is definitely something that is quite real. And I tend to think that people are definitely becoming emboldened under Trump. And I think part of it is also isn't just the extreme forms of hate that we talk about, but it's kind of what I call the everyday mundane operations of white supremacy. So for example, the fact that we've seen people calling the police on black people for just doing everyday acts, just being a regular person, sleeping, going to the store, going to the pool. You can name it. All sorts of things we know that are happening. And we're starting to see some legislation behind this, right? In terms of, it's one local jurisdiction that is actually starting to criminalize people who are making false claims for calling the police on African Americans or anyone else. And I tend to think that part of it is thinking about how we go about this process. I think from a legislative standpoint, it's important to note that our taxpayer money is covering a lot of these resources. So in other words, if police officers are going out on false claims, then that means they actually can't focus on other incidents that they need to be focused on. So people are wasting resources. So at the least, these sort of things need to be criminalized in the sense where people need to be paying a fine, where people need to be held accountable for what's going on. But I mean, definitely Trump's rhetoric, as well as the people he's had in the White House, even simply from a representational standpoint, is quite different from other administrations. And by representation, I mean specifically race and gender representation. That the lack of race and gender representation in Trump's White House is something that is quite profound. That's something that, as diverse as the United States is, simply should not be happening, nor should we tolerate it. And so part of thinking about, as you were saying, President of the student body, is that who we vote for becomes very, very important. And I tend to think, instead of just focusing on national elections, we have to focus on local elections. You know, I think about Birmingham in Alabama. I think about Little Rock in Arkansas, both of whom just elected their first African-American mayors. Frank Scott Jr. is a friend of mine who's the mayor of Little Rock. We went to college together. We're fraternity brothers. And one of the things that he always talks about is that Republicans did a very good job of building the farm team when Obama got elected. They went underground. They built a farm team. So part of thinking about everything that's happening, it's not just about the fact that hate crimes have increased in these 200% in places where Trump held a campaign rally. These are also places that went red, became redder, or went blue to red. So we have to be very clear about that transition. I think part of the other thing we're thinking about with local politics is that when we talk about Republicans and Democrats, and I think we have an overly simplistic political system. I mean, there's no way that two parties, even if we want to include independents and the Green Party, captures people's political ideologies, even among black people. Like, black people aren't a homogenous group politically. But part of thinking through this means that what's happened to, say, Republicans who don't align with the alt-right, and as you were saying, we can clearly define what that is. That's like white supremacy. That's white nationalism. So saying alt-right is just a nice way of saying it. But what that means is that Republicans who don't align with the alt-right, conservatives who don't align with the alt-right, because we have an overly simplistic political system, that means they are troublesome bedfellows with them. So if we think about the Tea Party, for example, we don't hear much about the Tea Party anymore. That's because they are firmly embedded within the Republican Party. So Republicans who normally wouldn't vote with them actually are voting with them. And I think similar to what my grandfather told me, he spent 21 years in the military. Whenever I think about Lieutenant Collins, I think about my grandfather, and he would always say, our silence is our acceptance. Every single day in communities all across the country, whether they be conservative ones or liberal ones, we see acts that we become complicit in because we don't do anything. And so when I think about what Trump is doing, yes, he's inciting violence with a lot of people, but he is also creating a lot of silence by most of us, and we have to do something about that.
Do either of you want to respond to that, to the question, just from your perspectives around what you think is happening or seeing coming from the current political climate?
Well, my response to that is more towards what you said about the kind of like desensitization to these acts that we're seeing. I agree with that because, for example, on college campuses, these alt-right, these hate groups, and all of these things, they're organizing, they're having fellowship, they're in a sense, they're planning whatever it is they're planning, and it's become a normal thing to see around college campuses. You have college students who, oh, that's just a club, oh, that's just something, whatever they call it on various college campuses, but we can no longer become, I guess, accustomed to accepting when we see these groups organizing. That's my point.
And I just want to say too, right, we can't be silent. But with regard to the work of Southern Poverty Law Center at the height right after the election, we saw this huge increase in bias incidents. And guess where they happened? K through 12 schools. K through 12 schools. And Teaching Tolerance just published a report. It came out yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to read it. Well, actually came out like at 3 o'clock this morning. But it is responding to hate in schools. It's like and it is the first 4 pages that I've read. I've seen the incidents, but anything ranging from hate graffiti at school or to small kids calling people outside of their name, you know. And speaking of the climate of the current administration, we know that white supremacy recruitment, it all follows kind of the political climate of an administration. And because this administration is silent on it, supports it, encourages it, engages with it, people do feel much more emboldened in their actions and their acts. And that is something that we cannot turn a blind eye to. And I will say this too, along with that, when you have someone who is leading the country, who begins their campaign with dehumanizing a group of people, everything after that falls in line. And he started it with immigration, right? Mexicans are rapists, they're murderers, and they're so all of that, the dehumanization of a group of people, and we look at what happened at the beginning of kind of the civil rights movement with that, the dehumanization of a group of people, and so we have to pay attention to that. But I do encourage you all to read those reports as well. But yeah, we had a little test, and I said, oh, I'm sure it's college campuses. And when they said K through 12 schools, it shocked me, but I could also see it, right? Because hate is taught.
Yeah.
It is taught.
You know, what's actually interesting is I think last year's report that you all put out around teaching tolerance, and I don't have the exact statistic in front of me, but I do remember one that stood out to me was the percentage of high school students, and it might even been high school students who could articulate the actual causes of the Civil War. And I don't know if you know that one. I remember with some of the responses where maybe you can actually answer better than I might butcher it right now. So maybe you could share.
I remember it, and it brings back to memory. I'm the director of the Civil Rights Memorial Center, and so we get school groups that come in all the time. And a few weeks ago, of course, our focus is on the Civil Rights Movement. So I had an 8th grader raise his hand, and I said, oh, you know, yeah, do you have something you want to contribute? He said, well, I want to tell you about my visit to the Confederate Museum. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. Wow. But just that inundation of it. And then we had another student, we were talking about the Ku Klux Klan, and he said, well, Miss Taffney, my dad said the Ku Klux Klan kept people straight. But he really honestly meant it. Like you can't fault the child, because in his innocence, he really felt like the Ku Klux Klan was law and order back to our president.
Right. Yeah, just to close the loop on the point, the particular data point that I have, and I don't have the specific number, but what it did is asked high school students to identify the causes of the Civil War, and the statistical, I mean, it was alarming how many students were unable to identify specifically slavery as a cause of the war. So you could either call it active denial, passive denial, lack of education, whatever else have you, but there's definitely an inclination to look at the economic argument and really kind of extract the racial component from that. And that continues to, and what's troubling obviously is that what you guys are starting to pull out and share with Americans, share with all of us, is just what that begins to sort of help. What does that begin to do to people when they start to think about the reasons why our institutions look the way they do, the way our society looks the way it does? There's no connection to history. So, I mean, I know you, in some of your research and some of your work, history is really rooted in the work, but I'm kind of curious from what you're experiencing as an educator in the classroom. The first question I have is, how do you, as a professor who has personal values, personal beliefs, things that you know to be true in your own life, how do you sort of manage that in a classroom? Because I think one of the concerns is, and that one of the concerns that's often raised by the right, is that liberals are able to espouse their viewpoints in the classroom. Why shouldn't I be able to espouse my viewpoints as well? So how do you manage that, knowing the history that you have and sort of the body that you live in?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and one that I think as educators we think about a lot. I think I potentially think about it less than other people, because for me, I simply let the research guide me. The research findings are what they are, and what they show is that hate is on the rise. What they show is that racism isn't a thing of the past. What they show is that personal and institutional discrimination continues to proliferate. What it also shows is that as marginalized people, minority groups continue to be resilient and make progress in ways that that oftentimes people who are privileged have no way of making sense of. Like, it's one of the biggest things that baffles them. They're like, how do they keep on coming back? Like, they just keep on getting better. And so part of it for me is I let the research tell the story for me. The other thing I think for people who are educators in here and who plan to be educators, professors, teachers, et cetera, I have a few specific strategies that I use. Because one thing I really think about in class, while I don't think, like, I rarely take in what I personally believe, because again, I let the research kind of say what it's going to say. I do my due diligence with how I collect data, how I analyze data, and what the findings are, they are. And I think that becomes very, very important to note that that when it comes to a statistical standpoint or methodological standpoint, people can't really challenge me on that. So all they can then challenge you on is the interpretation, or they aim to attack you, which is kind of the basis of the question. So they get to attacking you. So, I mean, I have incidents in class. Like, for example, I was talking about the gender gap in pay. And I was like, you know, the gender gap in pay persists even when women are in the same professions with the same degrees, you know, at the same time. And a student yelled out, "That's not true." And I said, "Oh, yes, it is true. We can talk after class, but we're not going to do this right now." Right? The other thing, another strategy I have, though, is I show the faces of the scholars who are publishing work. And one thing a lot of people in this room know is that historically, pretty much most of the academics have been and still are white men. So what that does is it alters how students think about it. So I'm talking about race and I'm talking about a racial theory, and then I put up a picture of a white man. And it blows their mind. They're like, students are all confused because they think some of it's just propaganda, like I'm just saying this. And I'm like, no, this isn't the case. And so I have various strategies that I use. But, you know, I think in short, when you allow the research to guide you, then you have a whole lot to stand on. And, you know, rarely do I ever bring in my own personal views. I oftentimes play devil's advocate in class. Another strategy I have, this is a good one because discussion is always difficult for educators. Like, I do a lot of discussion in my classes, and I have some students here, graduate students in Maryland who have been my TAs. They know that I do this. I learn my students well, even in large classes. I do different surveys of them. I learn their attitudes. I know who reads. I know who writes well. And then what I do when I see students raise their hand, I'm like, A, B, C, D, and E. And I know that E is about to come with it. I'm like, E is about to put everybody in their place. And now all of a sudden, now I allow that student to have the final word without me, without anyone else know that that's what I'm doing. So I think you develop these strategies over time, but you know, I think it doesn't become personal opinion when it's fact.
Thank you. Good. So speaking of some facts, I want to come back here and talk about, you know, something that's already kind of come up, I think, early in our conversations, actually earlier in the opening remarks. You know, we've been inundated with these horrific headlines about hate-inspired shootings targeting those of Jewish faith, including several bombing threats sent to Jewish schools across Maryland that caused panic and forced evacuations. Richard, as we all know, was a young African-American man who was killed by a white man. So my question is, where and how does his story map onto or intersect with these church shooting stories? And how does Richard's case fit into the larger national conversation? And finally, you don't have to answer all these questions, but you know, I'd love it if you would. What are the implications of his case possibly not being deemed a hate crime alongside these church shootings?
So I think that goes back to how we talk about hate crimes and what's comfortable for us. I know each time that there's a church involved or school involved, it's and large groups of people, right? And it goes back to the comment you made earlier about calling it what it is, like domestic terrorism, domestic acts of hatred. With Richard being an African-American male, he actually falls into what has been the case with hate crimes for a long time when it comes to black folks, which is that is the most underreported group of hate crimes that there are. And that just has been historically the case with hate crimes, right? Because hate crimes are collected on the local level, right? I can kind of go back to the history, but I won't go that far back. But hate crimes are collected on the local level And local law enforcement are responsible for reporting it to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General reports it to the FBI and all of those things. And it goes back to the perception of who we are as Black folks, right? And so we talk about, I think, just in reading a couple of articles, how the language began to dismiss almost what happened to Richard, right? Because there were questions about what happened or what he said, but the affiliation of the young man with a hate group, right? And when we look at all of those factors in it, it just goes back to hate crimes are just underreported. We're still doing a very poor job of identifying hate crimes on the local level, right? There's nothing that forces anyone to do anything. I think the last big push was from President Bush, George W. Bush. That was the last big push with any form of like serious hate crime legislation, right? And so we're still having problems on that level from Congress. But and to answer your question, I don't know. Like, I don't know where it falls in the grand scheme of things. I know where I would like for all of them to fall, right? I think all of them need to be more than a headline. I think we said this earlier too, we tend to move on too fast. I think as a country, we move on too fast. When we had the Tree of Life, then there was Kroger, there was this month in October where there were 10 incidents of hate crimes. And within less than 30 days, no one else was talking about them, right? And so I think that is still a serious issue that we are facing when it comes to hate crime legislation.
I'm going to come back to you in a second, though. I actually have a question for you, but I want to because we've already started to talk about it, we've started to localize the conversation and talk a bit more about the importance of local reporting agencies. I actually want to refer to a recent Baltimore Sun report that found the African Americans were the most frequent targets of alleged hate crimes in Maryland in 2017, which is, of course, the year that Richard was killed. And in fact, they were targeted at a rate that is more than double the next highest group and more than triple the third highest group. However, it wasn't until this past February, meaning 2 months ago, that Maryland lawmakers, citing a sharp surge in hate crimes in the state, proposed stronger hate crime legislation. So I guess my question to you is, and it could be to all of you as well, is what's underneath that? What is, and specifically in Maryland, if we can talk about it and contextualize it within whether it's Maryland history, but the fact that, and I think the stat was in 2017 was 178 reported hate crimes or alleged hate crimes targeting Black folks in the state of Maryland. And the next highest group was like 70, right? And the next highest group after that was like 50. So, it's just striking that that was a reality 2 years ago and was probably been the reality for a while, but only now is there this move, at least by some legislators here in the state of Maryland, to strengthen the legislation that exists in the books.
Yeah, I mean, the part of kind of the current legislation, I think it says that you get fined, maybe you pay some community service, maybe you spend like 5 years on probation, and we're talking about kind of basic types of hate crimes. By basic, I mean graffiti, things that people try to protect under the First Amendment. And I think part of what is so frustrating about how we think about the First Amendment is that we act like that speech and language actually doesn't hurt. So, our parents teach us when we're kids, words don't hurt. Words actually do hurt. And words incite things, and it kind of leads to things. And so the new, proposal that they're saying is they're going to actually kind of double some of the sanctions. They're going to double the penalty. They're going to double the level of probation. But when I think about it, not just in Maryland, but more broadly, is kind of one simple premise that I think gets at the heart of it, is that racism is so normalized that everyday acts of hate are not criminalized. So what that means is that acts that we deem as hateful, other people who have different experiences actually don't consider them as hate. They consider it as normal. So calling someone the N-word, calling someone a derogatory comment, doing some type of other act that we consider to be hate is honestly so normalized, and something that in some households and in some communities is talked about so much that people actually don't deem it as something that should be criminal, or definitely not something that should be considered to be hate. I think the other part of it is we see throughout history and even contemporarily the continuous devaluing of black bodies. And part of thinking about not valuing black bodies is the fact that if you don't value black bodies or you dehumanize them, whether that be black folks or whether that be Latinos or people they perceive to be Mexican at the southwest border, whatever that might be, that means they're not valuable enough to do anything about. And I think part of the deepness of it isn't just about the devaluing, but it also means from a legislative standpoint or a court perspective or a political perspective that they're not worth the resource investment. And see, that's why I keep coming back to our tax money. Like in Prince George's County alone, I don't know about you, I live in Prince George's County. We pay a heck of a lot of taxes. And we have the ability to hold the people who we elect accountable for what we want to see. And instead what's happening, we're allowing our resources to be used for things that we don't think they should be used for. But part of that is because also we've been bamboozled and hoodwinked into accepting the way things are. So certain things that say the current generation, when I think about Generation Z in school and, you know, that certain things that they don't tolerate are things that maybe my generation tolerated, that they don't tolerate. And I tell them to keep going because don't necessarily let me and my generation and older generation stymie the fact that there are certain things that you won't tolerate anymore. So it's really like up to your generation to say, we're not gonna allow this, but then you also use additional generations to help you mobilize. And I think part of this in terms of thinking about Maryland legislation is one of the reasons why nothing's been done about it is because there hasn't been a whole lot of public pressure. The thing about Maryland, out of every state I've lived in a lot of states around the country. I mean, Tennessee, California, Indiana, Michigan, I mean, some others too, Georgia, et cetera. Maryland is the one of the primary states I've been in where they really respond to what the public thinks. Like sometimes in the same day. Like, I mean, it's like something happens and then all of a sudden in Annapolis they're doing something. I think part of it is Maryland is so close to DC that, you know, I think it's something about that. But what that means is we can put pressure on our elected officials. Pressure is really, really big and it matters a lot. And I think at times in a Prince George's County, the most affluent black county in the country, sometimes we get comfortable. Sometimes we get okay with our little bubbles. Sometimes we get okay with our churches and our schools and our jobs and our grocery stores and our communities where we see people who look like us doing well. But the one thing I know is there are people in the southern part of Prince George's County and other parts of Maryland who aren't living like us. And so we have to, you know, what I'm encouraging us to do is to do more. I tend to think how comfortable we get and the lack of pressure we put on our elected officials is something that we can actually do something about.
Dude, I'm going to come back to you because we're talking about your generation, so I want to hone in on it a bit. So, you know, a lot of the criticism of the current state of affairs is being directed to big social media companies, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And the criticism is that they're not doing enough to, and that perhaps they should be regulated. They're not doing enough to regulate what's happening on their platforms, and that perhaps they should be regulated, fined, or in some way held accountable for the actions of their users. Now, of course, just yesterday, Facebook and Instagram actually made a move to ban certain far-right, what they've defined as far-right extremists from the platforms. That being said, as a member of a generation that is often defined by or considered synonymous with social media, do you think these social media companies have a role and responsibility? And do you think they can be useful tools, these platforms? Do you think they can be useful tools in addressing hate and hatred and extremism?
Absolutely. So right now, social media platforms, they're more so reactive more than proactive. So what they do is they wait for things to happen and they release a statement or they make a temporary change and then months later it goes up in the thin air and people forget about it. Social media is a platform to influence. Lots of social media has lots of influencers that influence, and anyone who uses social media for something such as hate, they should be held accountable for it, 100%.
And I know, of course, you spoke about it already, and I've had an opportunity to do some work with the folks that do the work at your organization. You brought up PayPal, you brought up a couple other accounts, and I know that you've also had some successes. So one of the things that has been, I think, there's the model, what if you call it, the model code that you've at least created in consortium or in partnership with a number of other organizations. Maybe for those of us who don't know about those, because at this point I know that a lot of organizations that these model codes for conduct online have not been formally adopted by a number of platforms, although they've been sent to them, and that's been a few months. Right. What is that? What are these model codes, and what maybe could people do to help push these forward?
So I can't speak to the model codes in details because I'm not a part of that. I'm not a part of that work in that sense. But I can speak just about the push for it, and it spans beyond kind of like the hate group activities as well. The Fair Housing World had a movement. They just won a massive lawsuit against Facebook for advertising as far as steering and housing segregation and things of that nature. So we're seeing a lot of social justice groups come together and do that work. So I don't have a lot to report on that because, again, I'm not close to that work. That happens in another area.
Well, that's it. I would encourage folks, if you do go to the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, dig into that, learn a bit more about what they're doing, again, in partnership with a number of other progressive organizations, like Color of Change is a part of this consortium. You might be familiar with their work to really get these platforms that have a huge voice in our world and our lives to be accountable, and to be accountable to some consistent policies and practices, because right now they're sort of doing things piecemeal and, as Dawood already said, in a very reactionary way. And yet there are organizations out there who have history and experience that are attempting to organize ways in which they can create policies that prevent these sorts of behaviors that we're seeing online.
And that did happen with Google as well. I will put a pin in that. I do know a little bit about that. But with Google, with the analytics, that is one thing that the Intelligence Project worked really closely with Google, because when the incident happened in Charleston with the African American Methodist Church and that murder, they looked at Google Analytics and wanted to know, like, how did Dylan Roof get all of this information? And Google actually ignored a letter that was sent to them with regard to that, and then it was after the murder they actually went in and changed the analytics. So it shows how these groups rise to the top, and so you have organizations who are pushing that as well. Because not everything you Google is true, right?
So we've been talking a bit around, hate crime and hate crime legislation, and thank you so much for, bringing up and talking a bit about what exists in Maryland. And I think we even talked a bit about the fact that there has not been new legislation for a number of administrations. But I think it might be valuable for folks in the room to just understand a little bit, what is the distinguishing characteristic? What distinguishes, a hate crime and that designation from a crime that is, that is just one of the garden variety ones that we are more accustomed to hearing and knowing about. So both locally, of course, you did talk about what could exist locally, but I'm curious about at the federal level, like what is a hate crime and how does one get that designation as a hate crime?
So the hate crime designation changed, I can't remember the year, but before a hate crime designation, you had to be participating in some type of federal activity, whether it was like voting, going to school, or something like that. But then in 2009, I believe it was, the Matthew Shepard murder, and also the murder of James Byrd, actually changed that, so you don't have to be participating in any type of like federal activity for you to have that designation of a hate crime. But it is someone who is targeted because of their race, their gender identity, ethnicity. So those immutable characteristics that one cannot change.
And is there some kind of evidence that one would need to look and to prove, to demonstrate that that was actually the reason they were targeted?
Yeah. So I'm not law enforcement, nor am I an attorney, so I can't speak to that like in specific terms, but just in more broadly terms, we do encourage on the local level that people not just look at it as a blanket crime, but they do diligence in investigating to see if that person was targeted because of one of those characteristics or any of those characteristics that I named.
Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add something quickly. I think part of also what happens with hate crimes is we end up taking people's intent or the word of the person who engaged in the act as being fact. So in other words, if a person actually targets someone because of their race, their gender identity, their religion, and then they say, I actually didn't do that, oftentimes law enforcement will take their word for that. And then, of course, the defense will use that as a way to say that that wasn't going on. And that's unfortunate because typically when there's a pattern of evidence, like with the incident around Lieutenant Collins, it shouldn't even be a question about what it is. But unfortunately it is because in our criminal justice system, we focus on intent instead of impact. If we actually focused on impact, I think we would end up having a very different outcome. I think the other thing, as I said before, is it has a lot to do with the fact that racism is normalized. So there are acts that are actually racial or racialized that we don't consider them to actually be that way. And so what we actually have to do is to continue to use a particular type of language, to continue to raise awareness about these incidents, to continue to compile the data. Like I go to Southern Poverty Law Center all the time. That's how I know all the stuff, because that's where I get all my stuff about hate from. And part of thinking about that is that if we don't have the data, we can't really tell an accurate story. And so everybody kind of has a role to play. And I think part of what's happening right now in this particular movement that we're in is that we are in what Dr. Martin Luther King said, one of his first stages of a nonviolent campaign is a collection of facts. And we don't have all the information that we need for what's going on, and we need better evidence and better data. And part of it, we can't necessarily just rely, say, on the police to do it because they are like under-resourced, overworked, and at times they don't necessarily have the skill set to specifically do that. We need people in other facets of life, from the academy, from the nonprofit world, to really put pressure on our elected officials to allocate funding to collect data that gives us an accurate portrait of what's going on.
So we are starting to wind down in time, and I want to get some sort of parting thoughts, because I know we're going to have a call to action after this panel, but you know, each of you in your own walks of life, and you've all touched on it in some specific ways, but I do think there's some value in a conversation like this that deals with problems and challenges, and you've all offered various kinds of solutions. But I would, I'm going to kind of just run through each of you, and I'm going to have a question that is really kind of forward-looking, and it helps to maybe concretize things for folks as they move forward and think about what they can do to address things. So I'm going to start at the very end, and I'm going to ask Dawuda, your generation's often cited as the most diverse, least bigoted, and most progressive generation in the history of this country. Whether or not you agree with this assessment, it's up for debate. I'm curious, what are some of the barriers that you see to action for your generation? What are some of the barriers to action that you think stand in the way of your peers becoming more actively engaged in struggle? And what would you think it would take to engage them in, and I'm going to use the word sustained struggle? So of course we get folks who can show up, can do things that might be in the moment, but what do you think it might take to get them engaged in sustained struggle?
So my answer to that, what would it take to get them to engage? I think all it's going to take is just for them to realize that they are Lieutenant Collins. That's all it's going to take. A lot of my generation, they get on social media, they get on whatever platforms that they get on, and they express their views about these things that happen. But how many of my generation actually take action, actually go out there and vote to see the changes that they talk about on social media? In the perfect world, my generation is the least bigoted. My generation has the least hate in the perfect world. But the reality is, with every generation, there's hate being taught, like we spoke about earlier. Hate is constantly being taught in every generation, whether it's mine, whether it's the one before, and it's going to be taught in future generations. And like it was said previously, we can't always, unfortunately, the person can't always be blamed. So it's my generation and future generations' responsibility to eradicate the hate by educating and hoping that those who we're talking to are going to listen. And that's it.
Thank you. A slightly different take on the same question. So you travel, of course, across the country. You speak to all sorts of groups, and you have an opportunity to work with an international organization that has a really broad reach. So my question is, what are some of the actions that you're seeing other communities, groups, and even individuals across the country take to address and end intolerance? And what are some of the tools that the SPLC offers to help educate and advocate for change?
So I'll speak. I am seeing a lot more communities mobilize, to use your word, in sustainable ways. And I'm also seeing them do this from a lens that is more focused on restorative justice and also racial reconciliation and healing within communities, right? Because I think that that is going to be a piece that we cannot, like, we just can't skip that piece anymore. And we have to have some honest dialogues within our communities, outside of our communities. I know I have this thing in my home first, right? Then to my family, and then to my community at large. And that's how I think we do that. And even in the context of the work at Southern Poverty Law Center, we have to do some stuff internally, right? We can do this work, and we've been doing it now for 47 years. And we can keep doing this work. I've been doing social justice work for 20 years. Never thought I would end up doing social justice work. But it is a passion of mine because I do believe, I firmly believe, that we will get it right, right? Some other things that I'm seeing people do more than I've seen before. When I first started in this world, most of the social justice groups operated in silos, right? So I'm seeing them collaborate more with each other and complementing the work that we're doing, working more together on these issues, and also grassroots organizing. I just can't, you know, I can't say enough about grassroots organizing. I think it is at the crux of localized communities and what we do, and also working with our younger generation. We oftentimes hear the, like, pass the baton, but you know, they need to sit at the feet of some elders too, right? So, you know, and we want to make sure that we're doing this work with them, beside them, right? So that they can take the baton, right? And lead us moving forward. Some other tools, I'll talk about SPLC. Our website is full of tools. We have our 10 ways to fight hate. One of the things, since we're focusing on hate crimes, I do want you all to, if you haven't read this report, it's Hate Crimes Explained. It's a very detailed report about the history of the hate crime law, the Uniform Act, how it evolved, when it evolved, and how the laws changed, and also offers some practical tips about what you can do to push local legislation as well. There's also the report that I just told you all about, and then there's 10 ways to fight hate in your community. And this is responding to most of the people think that they're getting this publication to respond to hate group activity, but it's really also about responding to hate and bias incidents in your communities as well. So it's a combination of those things. And I think that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. So, so I'm going to put a little twist on yours. I'm not going to ask you about the students and what you can do to mobilize students. I'm curious, like, what do you think are some suggested actions you believe that colleges and universities can take to address and end hatred and intolerance on their campuses?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I mean, I think first, events like this. I mean, President Bro, Vice President Swinton. I mean, these type of events on college campuses take courage to do. And so we applaud you all and everyone else who did this. Vice President Clement coming from the University of Maryland, like, these type of acts take courage. And I think part of what people don't realize is that for faculty members in particular, for administrators, there's oftentimes a lot of pressure to not do anything. It's pressure to be so reactive that this is just gonna brush over. So it's actually at times a radical act to do something. And I think that needs to kind of be acknowledged. I think the other part of it is what I call a racial equity framework. I always think, what can we take away from this? When I teach race relations, I would have students come up to me at the end of the semester and they would be so downtrodden. Like Asia Gayfield is up at the top. She's been my TA in one of these classes. Like, they're so downtrodden that they're like, the world sucks, it's horrible. Racism is horrible, we're never gonna be able to do anything about it. And it pushed me to come up with strategies and solutions that they can actually do something about. And I came up with the framework that I call a racial equity framework that people can actually employ. The first is a 3-step process. The first is to be a racial equity learner, which is what I think we do at events like this. We come and we learn. The second is to be a racial equity advocate. The reason why I don't say ally as much, because I view ally as kind of passive. Like you can be an ally and be present and not really do anything. But to be an advocate, it suggests you are advocating for people who can't advocate for themselves even when they aren't present, which means at your own dinner table, with your own friends. So when I think about what we can do, if all of us speak up and speak out against people who we love, with people who we love, we basically covered the world. I mean, when you really think about it, like if I speak up against and speak out with the people who I care most about, who sit at my own dinner table, who are at my Thanksgiving table, who are with me for the holidays, for Christmas, and I say, hold on, that was a little off. People probably would consider that racist. We need to have a conversation about that. Then I'm doing my job instead of necessarily letting it go unchecked. And then I think the third thing we can do is we can become racial equity brokers. This means where we work, what we do, particularly at the university, we can think about policies and practices that make a difference. You know, and like for me, I mean, I'm so happy and thrilled actually to see so many of my University of Maryland colleagues here. I mean, like Jane Hirschberger, who's done tons of work at the University of Maryland, bringing plays and performances to make people critically think about what's going on, not just to let people leave. You know how you go to a movie, then you leave and have a conversation? Jane is like, no, after the performance, I'm about to put a panel together and we're gonna talk about the race and the gender and all the stuff that's happening in this. You know, like I think about Dr. Keon Gilbert, who came from St. Louis University, who has been doing tons of work in Ferguson around helping particularly black men think about their health, because I think part of what we had to think about is experiencing racism and trying to do something about it will kill you. Like it will kill you. It will kill you acutely in the case of Lieutenant Collins, or it will kill you slowly. And we have to think critically about our own health to protect ourselves. You know, I think about the work that people in the art department and other departments are doing to kind of raise awareness through different types of activities. The point is all of us can use our skill set to make a difference. And I think if we simply arm ourselves. The other thing I do, and this will be my last point, most of the stuff I'm saying, I actually practice. Like, and I say that to say that when I deal with racism, because we deal with it a lot, through microaggressions and other sort of things, I practice my response. I have a very simple premise. If I'm not gonna see you again, I check you on the spot. And the reason why I check you, honestly, is less about you, it's more about me, because if I don't check you, then I spend mental minutes processing that I didn't do anything about it, or that I let something that happened to someone else, and that starts to affect my own mental, emotional, and physical health. So even if I don't do anything in the spot, I write a letter. Somebody discriminates against me or somebody else in a public place, I write a letter to corporate. Oftentimes they send you gift certificates and stuff, which is cool. I'm like, I don't really want that. Like, I actually want you to change a policy. I give them suggestions. The other thing I do, if it's somebody who I'm gonna see again, I wait like a cat. I practice in the mirror and I practice. I'm like, I don't know when this moment is gonna come back up. It might be a year from now, 2 years from now, but when I get the chance, I'm about to check the mess out of them. And I do. And so part of doing this is because when we deal with racism, we have to get it off of ourselves. So part of what I'm getting at is if we all speak up and speak out with the people who we truly love and like, we can actually make a huge difference in the world, and there's nothing too small that can actually do something to prevent hate.
So if you would just mind giving these wonderful panelists a real round of applause. Forward with hope. Outstanding work, outstanding work. Nicely done, nicely done.
Dax, I want to thank you for being so deft in handling that conversation. I want to thank our powerhouse panelists. Every single one of you have gotten my notebook full of notes. So thank you again. One more hand for the panelists, everybody. All right, now that our minds are invigorated and our hearts have been filled, I want to make sure that we do also feed our spirits with another artistic tribute coming to the stage at this time from the University of Maryland, College Park, the Maryland Gospel Choir at UMD.
to the Collins family. We were with you when your son was honored a few months ago on our campus, and we're so excited to be here today to share in this celebration for us to get motivated and moved to do something. So we have two quick selections. One is called You Are My Strength, because Daddy Collins was talking about where his strength came from and where it is, and we forget our strength comes from the Lord, and we need to call on his name to activate, to do the things we need done. And then with that, we're going to lift our hands and give him praise because of what he's going to help us do. So please join in with us. Are you are my hope. You are my hope like no other. Hope like no other. Hope like no other. Hope like no other. What does it do? It reaches to you. Reaches. What the Collins are doing. They've been lifted up to do something. You lift me up in the fullness of your God, give us unfailing love. Stronger than mountain, stronger than mountains. It's deeper than what? Deeper than oceans. It reaches to me, reaches to me.
With my hands lifted up and my mouth filled with praise, my heart's overwhelmed with joy, I will always bless your name. With my hands lifted up and my mouth filled with praise, my heart's overwhelmed with joy, I will always bless your name. Bless your name, I will always bless your name. You are the one. I can always count on you to always bring me through my darkest days. I have no doubt there's no one on earth that compares to you. Let all the nations sing. Filled with praise, with joy, said with my hands lifted up to you, Jesus. Filled with praise, with joy. So we say, say, we say, with my hands lifted up, filled with praise, with joy, that lifts my hands to you, yeah, filled with praise, with joy, we say, say, we say, bless your name. Bless your name. Say, bless your name. Bless your name. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, all that's within me. Say, bless the Lord, oh my soul, all that's within me. Yeah. So with my hands lifted up and my mouth filled with praise, my heart's overwhelmed with joy. Lord, I'll always bless your name. With my hands lifted up and my mouth filled with praise, my heart's overwhelmed with joy. Lord, I'll always, I promise to always, Lord, I'll always bless the Lord, oh my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Can you lift your voice and say, bless the Lord? Say, oh my soul, and all that is within me, in me, yeah. Bless his holy, bless his holy name. For he has done so many great things, say, has done great things. He has done great things. Said he has done great things. So bless his holy, bless his holy name.
Thank you again, Maryland Gospel Choir at UMD. All right, we've been given a lot of motivation. If you are not motivated towards justice right now, I don't know what to tell you. All the information that we were given by our fabulous panel, all of the inspiration we've been given by these wonderful young people who have performed for us today. What now? So, referring back to the many, many notes that I took during the panel, I wish I was this excited to write things down when I was an undergraduate. There's so many nuggets. The underlying culture and spirit of hate that led to Richie's murder. Follow the data, follow the research. Richard became focused and he became a poised leader at BSU. He and his family did everything right, and yet, why did this incident happen? We must enable the conversations that individually and collectively should shift the paradigm of hate to get to a place of tolerance and understanding. DeWuda, when you said civic participation leads to accountability and that your generation needs to do something, that was powerful. So here's the call to action, ladies and gentlemen. From our panel, we heard that we do have an awesome responsibility to help change the legislation, to be civically engaged and to change the law so that crimes of intolerance and, quite frankly, unacceptable behavior are prosecuted as hate crimes. Are we agreed on that? Another point, encouraging both individual lifestyle changes and how we interact as a society. Practicing daily small acts, not just of tolerance, but even checking yourself and your loved ones. Taffany said, in my house first. Thirdly, grassroots mobilization, organizing, hearkening back to the civil rights era. We have to keep today's conversation going. So that hashtag that you see up on the screen, How I Fight Hate, is just one small act that you can do to keep the conversation going. But we must, and I'm quoting the panel again, confront the very fabric of America. And we have to do that as a conversation together. So at this time, I want to bring this part of the program to a close, and I want to invite our undergraduates from both universities to leave here and go to your right to the ballroom, where there's going to be a students-only open mic session. And we're asking that any reporters, including student reporters, not record, because we want this to be an open and honest conversation. And don't worry, students, we're feeding you. I also want to recognize and acknowledge the staff and faculty members at both campuses who thought it not robbery to come here this evening after laboring all day at their respective campuses. Thank you for spending this evening with us. I also want to recognize the people who we call the organizing committee. First and foremost, could you please rise, Dr. Zita Nunez. We have to give this woman a hand. It was Zita's passion and her original vision that was the organizing principle around this evening. I also want to recognize from BSU Events and Conference Services, Ms. Annette Wedderburn, from our Fine and Performing Arts program, Professor Gina Lewis, from our Division of University Relations and Marketing, Cassandra Robinson, Keisha Atkins, and Demita Chambers, Dr. April Johnson from the Bowie State University Department of Student Affairs, Dr. Sandra Gaines from our Department of Academic Affairs, and last but certainly not least, some members of the team from Institutional Advancement, and in particular, I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Carmelita Conti, who kept the trains running. Please give these folks a hand. So students, as you make your way to the open mic session to share your ideas, to share your vision for the future about changing the culture of hate, I want to close this part of the program by thanking everyone and asking you to take a look at the back of your program, where you'll see the Unity mural that was created as a joint community project that will now hang here at Bowie State University for the next month here in the Student Center before it moves over to our Fine and Performing Arts Center. This Unity mural right now is hanging right out front in front of the ballrooms. Please take a look at it and think about the concepts that it represents. And with that, it has been my pleasure to be your host this evening. Thank you. Something up here made me allergic. My eyes just started watering right in the middle. Did you see it? Yeah. Yeah. No, it's something. I think I'm allergic to something back here. But I'm good. everyone. We do have a reception for all the audience members, so please join us for light refreshments across the hall.